So until last video, we created this page of the execute automation reporting system, and we also saw how to add the themes and how to add the complete customization for these controls and how to add the banners and all those stuffs. All right, so now we have to add the actual functionality of these controls that you are seeing right here. So as you can see that the value for this particular grid is being populated from the code right from here in the index page. As you can see here, if you scroll down a little bit, there is an ASP:SQL data source, and there is an ID called SQL data source 1, and there is a runner server connection string. So as you can see, this is kind of little hard coded, right? Because your query is kind of hard coded here. So let's say if I want to add, let's say test cycle ID. So for test cycle ID, I should go back here and I should add here the test cycle ID, something like this, and I have to save it. And then if I execute this particular code, you can see that the test cycle ID will also be displayed. But it will not be displayed because it will just query, but in the UI part we have not tell anything that this is where I have to add the test cycle ID. So again, I have to go back here and I just have to copy this bound field. I have to add it right here, and here in the data field I should say test cycle ID, and the header text can be anything, maybe test cycle, something like that. And then I can say the sort expression, or I can even remove that if I don't want to. And now if I go back here to my page and if I hit refresh, you can see that our test cycle ID will be appearing here as well. So it is kind of okay, but if I don't want to show this test cycle ID, or if I want to bind the value, maybe different query in future, then I have to go back to the ASPX code behind like this, and then I have to change the value. But it's kind of pain because your connection string, your query, everything is sitting in right here in the ASPX file, which is not going to really work out in a real-time environment because nobody else in the world will ever write code like this. So for writing a better code or the better code practice, it is always a best practice that you isolate your model from the view. So as you can see here, this is actually your model and this is your view. So if you have already have little idea on what is model view controller, then this is going to really make you a sense. So this is kind of model because the data is where it is actually coming, and the controller itself is completely missing here. So by the way, I'm just going to cut this code, and right now if I try to refresh this code, you will see that we will get no value or exception. So you can see that we are getting an exception, which is okay because this is pretty much expected. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to stop here and I'm going to add a few lines of code stealing from our EA framework. Remember, if you have already purchased the course of Execute Automation Framework or the EA framework that we developed in these two courses, the automation framework development with Selenium C#, if you have already purchased this course, you will see that we have already developed something called as database extension helpers. So in these classes, in these lectures, I have already added the code for developing the code that we're going to copy from. And also here in the automation framework development with Code.UI test 2015. And again, here also we have developed the database and Excel helper libraries. So we're going to copy the same code. So if you have already purchased any of these courses, then this code is going to be very, very easy for you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy some of the code from that particular framework. So this is the code actually I'm going to copy from the course Automation Framework Development with Selenium C# Advanced. So I'm just going to copy from there. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go to the EA Auto Framework, and from here I'm just going to copy some of the code from the database helper extensions. So this is the code, and what I'm going to do, I'm not even going to think about any of this. I'm just going to copy the whole code, and I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to go over to my Execute Automation reporting system. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to add a folder here, and the reason is because we are going to add a utility for our Execute Automation reporting system. So that's why I'm just going to create a folder and I'm going to isolate from the rest of the code, and let's call this as utilities, and within this utilities I'm just going to add a class, and that particular class is going to hold the code that we have copy pasted. So let's call this as the database helper maybe. And then within this particular class, I'm just going to paste all these codes. And you can see that these are kind of extension methods, and since it is an extension method, your class should also be a static class to make use of it. So I'm just going to make this as a static, and then I'm going to add a reference for the SQL connection. So let's add the SQL connection references. So basically what it's going to do is it's just going to do a very few stuff here, something like opening a connectivity and then executing some of the queries and also executing the stored procedures on the database. So that's what it is going to do. And you can see that this particular method, the db connect method, will actually open the connectivity with your ers_db, and you can also close the connectivity from your ers_db using db close method. And there is a execute query method where if you pass the query string, it will execute the query that you executed, remember, in the SQL Server Management Studio. That's exactly what it is going to do. So I'm just going to add one more reference for system.data for the data table, and then we'll see what is missing. All right, so just add that here, and the data dictionary entry is missing, the collection. All right, looks pretty cool as of now, so everything's good. So the methods we have is this: db close, db connect, execute proc with param dt, and execute query. That's it, right? So these are the methods that we are going to make use of it in this particular ers UI. So the last thing which we need to do is we're going to make use of this particular db helper into ASPX page. So instead of the hard-coded code that I just removed from this particular place, what I'm going to do, we need to query the database manually this time, because I have removed that particular ASP_ data source stuff. And rather, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the index.aspx, the code behind file. Remember the one which we discussed in our previous videos? I'm just going to go over here, and within this page_load, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do two things. First, connect with the reporting database, or otherwise called as our ersdb. And once I get connected to the ersdb, then I execute a query to fetch the data for grid. And once I fetch the data for the grid, then I need to bind the data to the grid view, right? So these are the three steps that I need to do right now. So first of all, I need to connect with our reporting server. So for that, I'm going to go to my SQL Server Management Studio, and let's authenticate with our SQL Server authentication, and I'm just going to enter my password. So we know what is the database connection string to connect this particular database. So what I'm going to do, I'm also going to add a little more connection string information into the web.config file. So here we have a web.config file, and this is the ers_db connection string. I have just added this before, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make use of the same database connection string this time, and this is the connection string which I'm going to make use of, the ers_db connection string. This is the name of it, so I will just use that. So instead of writing a code right here to make the connectivity to the database, what I'm going to do to make our life a little easier, I'm going to go to the dbhelper.cs file, and within this particular file, we will add the code for it. And the code which I'm going to write is this: public static void connect reporting server. And here is where our connection string connectivity is going to happen. But before performing the connectivity, I'm also going to create a very small class. If you have already watched my previous videos on the Execute Automation's advanced framework development course for Selenium and Coder.UI, we have something called as a settings.cs class. I'm just going to make use of the same concept here as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a class here, and I'm going to name it as settings.cs. And within this setting.cs, I'm just going to add two properties, just two properties. And the one property is going to be the reporting connection string. So let's give this as reporting connection string. Oops, and let's name this, give a type a string, and then I'm gonna give the SQL connection. Let's add the type, and here I'm gonna call this as reporting connection. Just gonna save it, right? So these are the two properties that I'm gonna make use of in our dbhelper.cs. So this will be very, very helpful, something like this. Settings dot reporting connection string is equal to, I'm just going to read the configuration information and then I'm going to store it right into the settings dot reporting connection string, right? So that's why I'm just making use of these things. So there's something called configuration manager. So I'm just going to call the configuration manager dot connection string, and I'm just going to pass the index value or the actual name of the connection string. So the name of the connection string is nothing but our errors underscore db connection string. So I'm just going to copy paste it right here, dot connection string, right? So this is going to hold the connection string right now for me, and then connecting to the db. So for that, what I'm going to do, settings dot report connection is equal to perform a connectivity, all we have to do is reporting connection dot, there is something called as db connect. So if I call this method, it is going to connect to the database, and you have to pass the connection string here. So the connection string is nothing but settings dot reporting connection string. Super easy, right? So this method, connect reporting server, is going to perform the connectivity to our database right now, and then you can perform the rest of operation like executing the query and executing the store procedure, right? So I'm not really going to deep dive into what this method is doing because we have already discussed about these things a lot in our free courses as well as in our paid course. So it's again going to be completely out of the scope of what the course which we are discussing this time. So now we have to connect to our errors underscore db, and we have already connected to the server using a very, very simple method called as db helpers. And let's add the reference, oops, shit, db helper, okay, errors underscore utilities dot, I'm just going to call connect reporting server. So this is going to connect to our reporting server, and now I'm going to write a very, very simple query to fetch the data for my grid, right? So remember in our this code we deleted a line here. Can we just do a control Z? You can see that the SQL data source has a command like select test cycle ID, AUT name, application from this particular table. We can also do this. We can just cut or copy the some of the lines from there, and then we can just make use of it right here. Very, very simple, right? So this is what I require. So I'm just going to select the test cycle ID, AUT name, executed by, requested by, build number, application version from TBL test cycle, right? And then we have to execute this query, right? So in order for executing this query, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to make use of our settings dot reporting con, and then here there is a method called execute query. Here you need to just pass the query. This is going to execute the query, right? And you can see that this method actually returns something called as data table. So I'm just going to call the data table, right? So this table is where my data is actually sitting, and now I have to bind this particular data into my data grid. That's our last step, right? So for doing that, because if you don't bind anything in here, then there won't be any data for your data source, and you'll be getting an exception, something like this. It says that the data source grid v1 must be an ID for the iData source with SQL Server ID could not be found. And we can also rectify this error if I go back to my index.axpx page. There is something called as data source ID. So let's remove this guy because we don't require them anymore. And let's save it and let's try to execute this. if we don't get the same error maybe. All right, you can see that this time we're not getting that error, at least this particular exception, but we don't see the data. And the reason is because we have not bind the grid with the data which is coming from the database, right? So for that, what I'm going to do, I will just bind the data using a simple data source binding method, right? So for that, I'm just going to stop the execution here, and let's quickly go to our index.exps page. And here we have something called as grid view 1, and then there is something called data source, and within this data source we can just bind with our table, this guy, the table. And then we have one more method called as data bind. We need to call this. If you don't, then the data binding will not happen. So I'm just going to call the data bind. I'm just going to save it, and let's try to run this code and see how it works. Now hopefully it should fetch the data from the database by connecting to it, and then it should show the data for us. There we go. Super. So this is how you can actually connect to your reporting database and fetch the data for you. And right now you can see that this particular connectivity is being customized, and execution of the query is customized, and connecting to the data source or binding to the data source with the grid view is also customized, because we are going to make use of a lot of customization upcoming videos of this course. Thank you.